Hi everyone, welcome back to part 2 of this video series on how to make a plan in chess. In part 1 we talked about the importance of making a plan, why you need one, how to create one, and importantly how to look at the imbalances in the position, the 7 imbalances that we listed out, to then use those as a basis for creating a plan. So if you haven't yet seen that video, do check it out. I'll drop a card on screen now and a link in the description below. Assuming that you have seen that video, we'll continue on with this one, and here we want to cover a 5-step critical thinking technique that will allow you to take those imbalances and use this 5-step critical thinking technique to actually create a tangible plan. So if you are new to the channel, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss a video, and any comments or questions you might have, do leave them down below. I'll get back to everyone, and don't forget to smash that thumbs up if you are enjoying this content and want to see more. So I'm actually going to flip the board here and we can look at this from the black perspective. So what we're first going to do in this position is go through the 5-step critical thinking technique that will allow you to then make a plan. And once we've been through those 5 steps, we'll then go through a worked example of how to apply it in this position. So the first step you need to take in applying this critical thinking technique is figure out the positive and negative imbalances for both sides. The second step in this process is figure out the side of the board you wish to play on. And bear in mind, you can only play where a favourable imbalance already exists for you, or there is the possibility of creating a favourable imbalance. The third step is don't calculate at this point. Instead, dream up fantasy positions. In other words, if you could pick up your pieces and place them anywhere on the board, where would you place them so that they were most optimally placed? The fourth step is once you find a fantasy position that makes you happy, you must figure out whether you can actually practically reach it. If you find that your position just isn't possible to implement, then you need to think of another dream position that you can actually work towards. And the fifth step in this process, once you've found that dream position that you actually have a chance of reaching, now you actually begin to calculate moves. And this is known as calculating candidate moves. So the candidate moves are all the moves that lead to our dream position. And in this final step, it's then your job to figure out the best order in which to play those moves and what your opponent could be doing in response to that. So that's a quick run through of the 5-step thinking technique, and now we'll look at this thinking technique in action. And if it seems difficult, I wouldn't worry too much at this stage, because the reality is it does take time for this thinking process to bed in, and the more you do this exercise, the better you'll get at it and the quicker you'll become at it as well. So even though this might seem like a massive time burner that you would never have enough time to go through in a game, if you do practice at this and stick with it, it will become much quicker and easier, and you'll see your results improving dramatically. So if we imagine we're playing the black pieces here, we've reached this middle game position out of an English opening, and we now have the question of what to do in this position. This game was played between 2 players in Los Angeles in 1989, Sadie with the white pieces and Silman with the black pieces. And as mentioned on previous videos, Jeremy Silman is a fantastic author of chess education books, and his book How to Reassess Your Chess is where a lot of the inspiration for this channel is coming from. So I highly recommend you check out that book if you're able to do so. I will drop a link in the description below, and I couldn't really recommend it highly enough because of how much it's helped my own chess improve. So the first thing to say, for the avoidance of doubt here, is we don't just want to mindlessly develop our pieces. So a very obvious move in this position is to simply develop the black bishop on c8. As we learn in the early principles of chess, it's important to develop your minor pieces early in the game, and so black might simply develop his light squared bishop here to d7 or to e6. And whilst they're not necessarily bad moves, you shouldn't necessarily just be developing pieces and hoping that you find a plan later on. Instead, you want to find a plan first and then develop your forces around that. So if we jump back to our 5-step critical thinking process, we know that the first step here is to assess the imbalances for both sides. So the first thing of note here is that white has the bishop pair here, so the 2 bishops on a3 and g2. However, the bishop on g2 is currently inactive, and it's a bad bishop because it's staring at its own pawns on e4 and c4. Whereas black's knight on c5 is very well placed, controlling a lot of squares in the centre of the board, and at the minute cutting the scope of this white squared bishop into the position, although white does have the option of trading off that knight if white wanted to. White also has double pawns in this position on c3 and c4, however they're not weak, they're actually giving white control over the centre, and crucially they're stopping black from making use of this d4 outpost. Ideally black would like to jump this knight back to e6 and then into d4, a very powerful outpost square, but that c3 pawn is preventing that. And the other thing to note here is the lack of open files. We do have a half open b file here, and white will be the one who's able to take advantage of that most quickly. But since material is equal here, and no one has an edge in space, as we can see both sides have all of their forces on their own side of the board here, then there isn't too much more to say with regards to the imbalances in the position. And remember, at this stage we're simply listing out the imbalances, we're not necessarily looking to start judging their respective values at this stage. So having done step 1 in the critical thinking technique, we now move on to step 2, which is figuring out which side of the board to play on. And remember, we only want to play on the side of a board where we have a favourable imbalance, or there is the possibility of creating one. And this is very important to remember. To give an example of why this is so important, imagine if black loved to attack and nothing pleased him more than mating the opponent's king. Then naturally such a player would start looking to the king side to see if they could attack the king there. But to do so in this position without following the 5-step thinking technique would be a mistake, because as we can see there are very few pieces actually pointing towards the white king side. We've got the knight on f6, there's a bishop on c8 which might be able to hop out. In a dream scenario we can start lifting a rook and moving the queen over, but we can't exactly say in this position that there are lots of black pieces on the king side ready to spring into the attack. And crucially, there are also very few weaknesses on the king side for white. So having looked at the king side, it now feels logical to turn our attention to the centre, and importantly consider the plan of breaking the position open here using the d-pawn. And we're now coming on to the third step of this thinking technique, which is to start dreaming up fantasy positions and then assessing from there. So if we imagine that we wanted to break open the centre here, we would be pushing this d-pawn forward to d5. The first thing we can note about that is that the knight on c5 would then be hanging because of this bishop on a3. So to execute this plan of pushing in the centre, we would first need to support this knight on c5 by pushing the b-pawn to b6, or alternatively move the knight away to e6 in order to then be able to push. The other thing to consider is that if we did push this d-pawn, white would then be able to take in a couple of ways, but one thing we can note is that it would definitely begin to open up the scope of this light squared bishop, which is currently a bad bishop staring at its own pawn. And so because of that powerful threat, it may be that we want to develop our own bishop to b7, also fianchettoed on the diagonal, in order to oppose this bishop on g2. So if we were to play in the centre of the board here, the position might look something like this. Now this is not a bad position for black, but what we do need to remember is it's taken 3 moves to actually reach this position. So we had to push our pawn to b6, then fianchetto the bishop to b7, and then play the d6, d5 push for a third move. In this fantasy position, we've not touched any of the white pieces. But what we now need to consider is what would white be doing in response while we are executing on this plan? Well, we can see here that for the white player, they have a very obvious plan to play on the king side. They already have a knight and a bishop over on this side of the board. They can also castle the king very quickly and bring the rook to the f file, and then they would be able to push this f pawn down the board to counter this play in the center. So for the white player, they can actually achieve this castle's f4 break in just 2 moves, which suggests that possibly this plan of playing in the center will be a little too slow. So although we've reached a good fantasy position, although it's perfectly possible to implement this position, which is the 4th rule of our critical thinking technique, we don't necessarily know if it's the best plan because of the time it will take to reach this position. So this position should still be stored away as a playable idea, but now we need to turn our attention to the queen side to consider whether or not we can create a more favourable imbalance for ourselves by playing on that side of the board. So looking at the queen side now, the first thing we notice is that there are no weaknesses on the queen side for the white camp. So it begs the question, can we create a weakness in the position there for white? In other words, can we create a favourable imbalance for ourselves on that side of the board? And the answer to that is yes. We can create an immediate crisis in the white position through the powerful pawn push b7, b5. By pushing this pawn forward, we would be asking white a question. Do they want to capture that pawn or leave the black pawn to capture on c4? If they let us capture on c4, we would then create permanently weak pawns on c4 and c3. The pawn chain in the center would be less fluid for white, and also the e4 pawn would be weak and permanently blocking the white squared bishop. Assuming that white didn't let us do that and they capture the pawn on b5, then when we recapture with the c pawn, we've now created a newly half open file, and we can soon imagine that a bishop would be able to fianchetto itself to say b7, or perhaps move in the other direction towards the center of the board. We bring a rook to the c file, and because the white pawn on c3 is backward, we would now have a target of attack down this newly half-open c-file. Now this is a good example of where there can sometimes be a fluidity around the thinking technique here, because in this position we've identified the fact that there aren't any weaknesses on the queen side at the moment, but the possibility does exist of creating one through this powerful pawn push. So we actually considered a candidate move before we considered the fantasy position that we might reach after playing such a move. If we were looking at this from the perspective of the fantasy position we want to reach, then it might look something like this. Here we can see that black has cranked open the c-file, his rook has now occupied that half-open file. The knight can soon move out of the way to open up the line of this rook against the white queen, and we also have opportunity to even break in the centre now because the knight on c5 is protected by the rook on c8. So this is a great fantasy position, we can definitely reach it, and now we have to consider the candidate moves in the starting position. So coming back to this position here, the main move to play here really presents itself. The reason we rejected our plan in the centre of the board is because of the time it took to implement it, but what's so great about this queenside plan is with this one pawn push, we instantly put the question to black, and therefore seize the initiative in the position, which is a powerful thing to do. So we're getting in on our plan first before the white player can get in on his kingside plan. So in the game, the b5 pawn push was played, white captured this pawn and black recaptured, and after castles by the white player, we then had bishop b7, freeing up the rook to come to the c-file. So we'll leave the game here. I do hope that this 5-step thinking technique was really helpful to you, and you're able to then apply this in your own games when you're formulating a plan. As always, if you do have any questions or comments about this, please do leave them down below. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and I hope to see you again on another video.